Hello and welcome back to the channel. We talk horror here. If that's something you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm not doing a video intro today. This took a lot longer than I thought it would. This is actually the last thing I'm recording, and I just wanted to say this is a list of every horror movie from 2023 that I saw in 2023. And I also included some psychological thrillers, and there's 2 documentaries on the list as well, but I think once I get to them, you'll understand, hopefully, when I talk about them, why they're included on the list. Let's just get into it. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey is a movie called Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, yet somehow is devoid of any sense of fun. I feel exhausted even talking about this movie. There's nothing interesting for me to highlight here except for the film's marketing campaign. It's amazing to me that they managed to get this film into theaters, because this is the worst film I've seen in a long time. There is no reason to seek this film out, not even for the morbidly curious. Run Rabbit Run is a rip-off movie. There's no other way of putting it. It's a mashup of ideas taken mainly from The Babadook and Hereditary, but its unoriginality is not what puts it this far down on the list. It's the editing. We have to talk about the editing in this film. Every scene has the exact same setup and resolution. There's a creepy kid, he does something, sinister. The single mother who confronts him about doing this creepy thing, and they freak out. An argument ensues, and it quickly resolves, but of course, before the end of the scene, we are shown that the child is hiding something from their mother, then it fades to black. And then we repeat. It's the structure of the entire film. All of these scenes fade to black. It's ridiculous. Take this insane editing and mix it with some truly baffling writing and this really ugly gray color palette, and you have one of the most unappealing films of the year. There's a part of me that thinks this could be studied by film students as an example of, what not to do when attempting to make an elevated horror film. And I don't really like that term, elevated horror, but that is clearly what they were going for, and they missed the mark by so much. Children of the Corn is not a movie I expected to be good considering the history of this franchise, but I was holding out a little hope for this one to at least be entertaining. It was picked up by Shudder, and obviously not all movies on their service are great, but I think they understand horror fans, and horror fans clearly want a good Children of the Corn movie. It shouldn't be this hard to get this concept right, but alas, here we are. The one positive thing I have to say about this is that I think the child actors are actually fine in this one. The movie more so stumbles where it tries to have some political commentary, and also with its terrible special effects. I'm sure they will reboot this franchise yet again in the future, so I'll just say better luck next time. All Fun and Games is such a weird movie. It's like they gave up halfway through making it. I'm not even kidding about this. It is so half-baked, it barely feels like a real movie. I have no idea how these people got roped into this, but it stars Natalia Dyer from Stranger Things and Asa Butterfield. Both of them do okay with what is given to them, but those are my only positives here. I don't want to recount the whole plot for you, but basically, this is a slasher where the murder weapon is a cursed dagger. The person who picks up the dagger and reads the words that are imprinted on it gets possessed and becomes our slasher villain. So there's this party with a bunch of teens, one of them gets possessed, and that person, of course, forces all of them to play these, messed up versions of childhood games. I am telling you all of this because that is what the movie sets up, but then they only play 2 games. One of the teens gets killed by playing hangman, and the rest of the movie is them playing hide and seek, where the people who gets found are killed. And I'm sorry, but isn't that like every slasher? The only difference here is that the killer actually says, let's play hide and seek. And then the movie just ends because it's 70 minutes long. There's some voiceover and credits. It's baffling. Slaughterhouse is a movie I wanted to root for so badly. I mean, look at this poster. It's glorious. And I'm gonna be honest, this did get some chuckles out of me, but it's this far down on the list because it feels like a YouTube skit that's been drawn out to 90 minutes. The production values are also really low. I could go into a whole rant about how inconsistent this movie is in regards to its villain, Like, at some points, the sloth is actually super fast and highly intelligent, but then at other times, it behaves like a regular sloth. I just think that if you're making a joke movie like this, you need to actually commit to the bit to make it work. But, whatever. This movie is called The Slaughterhouse. Let's just move on. There's Something Wrong with the Children has more polish than the previous films I've talked about on this list, but it is one of the worst written films I've seen all year. This is the last film I'll be talking about today that I think is truly terrible, so we just need to get through this one, and after that I'll sound a bit more positive. This movie falls into the trap that a lot of creepy kid movies do, where the children are never really scary, they're just annoying. In fact, I think that's the problem I have with most of the characters in this film. The actors are doing what they can, so I don't want to blame it on them. There's just a lot of pointless arguing that happens between the adults in this film, and it's extremely grating to listen to. They spend a lot of time arguing about what to do instead of actually doing something. It doesn't make any sense why they would do that, and it just comes across as a ham-fisted way to build tension between the characters. This was obviously made on a low budget, but they do a lot with little here, and that's one of the things I appreciated about this film. Like, I think the directing and some of the staging in these scenes actually work pretty well, but it's just so bogged down by the writing, the characters, and the music is also incredibly jarring. Like, I think the music would have worked for a different type of film. It has this sort of very harsh, loud 80s synth soundtrack to it, but I don't know, it doesn't really fit with the film, and tonally it just kind of feels a little weird. There's Something in the Barn marks our first really big jump in quality on the list. I want to be clear and say that this is nowhere near as bad as the first couple of films we've talked about here. This just wasn't made for me. It's a slapstick horror comedy about a killer gnome. The only reason I watched this is because it stars Martin Starr, who I actually really enjoy in comedy shows like Silicon Valley and Party Down. I think the thing that killed this film for me is that I feel like I've seen a lot of these jokes 1,000 times before, and then what's left is, the sort of slapstick, very gory type of comedy, and that's usually not my thing either. It's pretty well made once it actually gets to, the action, but I just didn't get any joy from it. It is a Christmas horror movie, though, that takes place in the northern parts of Norway, with Martin Starr being the father of this family that has inherited a property there. If this sounds like something you'd be into, maybe give it a go. Skinamarink really seems to be a love it or hate it type of film, so I think I just have to throw up my hands a little bit and say that this is not my type of movie. This is the only film on the list that I fell asleep to because I thought this was really boring. I mean, I hate to be a naysayer, but I have to say it. I've done some digging into analog horror this year, and after watching some more stuff, I think this works better for me in short bursts. This same director who did Skinamarink actually has a YouTube channel with shorts that I like a lot better than Skinamarink. But even so, I still don't think this type of horror is made for me. If you feel a really strong connection to this movie, like I know a lot of people do, me not liking it doesn't take away that connection. Every movie can't be made for everyone, and that's perfectly okay. The Mill is a perfect example of a film not being able to sustain its runtime. Within 10 minutes, you understand exactly what the filmmakers are trying to say, and from there on out, it becomes a waiting game. It's about this company worker who wakes up in an open-air prison cell with a computer-generated voice telling him that he's there because he's not working hard enough at his job. The rest of the movie is him doing pointless physical labor in hopes of escaping the prison. It's the least subtle thing in the world. I am usually okay with that, but 95% of this movie takes place inside of one prison cell, and he only ever talks to two people. One of them is the person who's locked up next to him, who we never see that person's face, and then the other voice we hear is a AI-generated voice. It just never really goes anywhere interesting. It's not poorly made. It's just a little tedious to sit through because you kind of know where it's going right away. The Outwaters is a found footage film about some people going out into the desert to shoot a music video, but of course things go horribly wrong. I talked about this in my video where I ranked every found footage horror film I've ever seen, and I ranked it pretty low, even though it's gained a bit of a cult following. Like with Skinamarink, I am clearly not a target demographic, since it taps into some of that analog horror I was talking about earlier. The most common complaint I hear about found footage movies is that nothing ever happens in them, and that's actually how I feel for long stretches of this movie. So if you disagree with me on Skinamarink, you'll probably disagree with me on this one as well. Consecration is directed by Christopher Smith, who has previously done films like Severance and Triangle. I love both of those, so I was excited to check this out. It's about a woman who travels to a remote Scottish convent to investigate the mysterious death of her brother. Early on, it gave me some Wicker Man vibes as this woman grows more and more frustrated with the spiritual ramblings of the people there. Jenna Malone plays the lead here, and I always like her. She does a good job here. There are some creepy moments early on, but as soon as the mystery starts to reveal itself, it falls apart quickly and becomes a bit silly. The further you get into the film, the more they start relying on flashbacks, and those parts are definitely the worst. They look quite cheap, and the events that happen in them are so ridiculous. I could see this becoming a so bad it's good type of film for some, but I think for me, the movie wasn't really bad enough for it to be entertaining in that way either. It's just kind of disappointing all around. Like most of Hulu's horror films this year, Appendage is based off of a short film with the same name. I like that they're giving indie filmmakers these opportunities to develop projects, but in my opinion, the quality of these films hasn't been great. Appendage isn't without its charm. It's essentially a modern take on Basket Case, but the humor never really landed for me. If this sounds interesting to you, I don't think it's a bad movie. It's just one of those, horror comedies that wasn't really made for me. The Last Voyage of the Demeter is the lowest rated out of all the big studio films on this list. It's yet another soulless attempt from Universal to reboot Dracula, but this time they are only adapting one specific chapter from the original novel. I am going to sound incredibly harsh regarding this film, because I think it's one of the most unnecessary films of the year, but that doesn't mean there aren't any redeemable qualities. It's a period piece, and it looks pretty expensive at times. Andrea Överdahl's direction is perfectly fine, but I think this is his weakest film yet. The cast is also quite good, and there are some fun vampire action, but there really isn't anything else exciting about this film, and I was quite bored throughout its 2-hour runtime. We already know exactly how this story is going to end right at the start, so there's no tension whatsoever. And I'm not saying that because I've seen other Dracula movies, or I know the book and I know the story. I'm saying that because they literally tell us in the opening text crawl what is about to happen, and then we get an opening scene that takes place after the rest of the movie. And listen, you can do a movie where the audience already knows the story and have it be pretty good. There are movies about true events that happen all the time, and of course, I don't go into those movies expecting to be surprised, right? But this really isn't it. I think for this to work, it needed to have characters that you cared about, and I did not care about a single person in this movie. I have seen other people include this in their top 10, so maybe give it a go if you think it sounds interesting. I really thought this was abysmal, and the only reason it's up this high on the list is because of its production values. Deliver Us has the energy of a 70s Hammer horror film. This is both a blessing and a curse, since by the 70s, the Hammer horror machine was running out of steam. It was around that time that they started making a lot of films about devil-worshipping cults. And there are some fun to be had with those films, but they are a far cry from what Hammer put out in their best years, the 50s and 60s. Like those late Hammer films, Deliver Us has a good look to it, and above average acting, but it's bogged down by a confusing script and lackluster scares. The amount of dream sequences in this film is especially egregious. I kind of like the cultish vibes, but vibes only get you so far. Out of every movie I disliked this year, It Lives Inside is the one I disliked the least, if that makes sense. It's about an Indian American teenage girl who falls victim to a curse that only targets young people of her community. Even though we've gotten a lot of these types of curse movies lately, I think this one had a unique spin to it, so it could have been really good. I like a lot of the ideas here. There's a solid coming-of-age foundation to this movie, where the main character has to discover herself to fight this monster that's been tied to her. And that's definitely the best part of the film, because the horror is unfortunately rather poorly done. There is not a single scene in this movie that is remotely scary or even all that interesting to look at. I could see some of these ideas being used in a better film in the future, because there's interesting stuff here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Little Bone Lodge, since I think it's the most forgettable movie on the list. It's very reminiscent of other home invasion thrillers, where the home invaders gets more than they bargain for, as the victims of the story aren't quite as innocent as they first seem. This is not a spoiler, because it is very clear what's going on from the film's opening scene, and that's actually my biggest problem with the movie. It's a perfectly alright time waster, but nothing here will surprise you. Fear the Night is directed by Neil LaBute and stars Maggie Q as a war veteran defending a group of women that's gathered for a bachelorette party during a home invasion. I had a lot of fun with this movie, but it's pretty low on the list because I have to admit that it barely makes any fucking sense. This is a type of movie where a main character gets killed and no one even reacts to it. Maggie Q sees her sister gets brutally killed early on, and in the next scene she's like spouting one-liners. It's completely unhinged. I wouldn't call this a good movie, but I do really like Maggie Q, and I have a soft spot for the type of absurd bullshit Neil LaBute puts into his scripts. This is the same man that brought us the hilariously terrible Wicker Man remake. So yeah, you can definitely call this a guilty pleasure for me. The Price We Pay is sort of reminiscent of From Dusk Till Dawn, where you have these two criminals hiding out in the countryside after a botched robbery, and of course they run into even bigger trouble. Unlike From Dusk Till Dawn, there aren't any vampires here. Instead, it turns more into a torture movie with some supernatural elements in the second half. It's kind of bonkers, and it's a really fun reveal when you find out what actually is going on. It stars Emile Hirsch and Steven Dorff, who I both quite like, and they're hamming it up a bit. They're having fun, and it's fun to watch them. So there's a lot of things that I like about this film, but I also have to admit that it does feel quite cheap at times. It's pretty inconsistent with its production values, which is probably due to budget constraints. I just couldn't put the film any higher on the list because of these issues, but I did think it was neat overall. The Meg 2 stars Jason Statham as he yet again fights a giant shark, just like he did in the original, sometimes with his bare hands and feet in this one. There are many problems with this film. It's way too long and has some of the most atrocious acting I've seen all year, but it also has Jason Statham kicking a giant shark in the face. If that sounds like something you would want to see, you're probably gonna have an alright time. If this would have been like a tight 90 minutes instead of 2 hours, it probably would have been a lot higher on the list. All Ice seems to be the micro-budget cult hit of the year. It's about a disgraced podcaster whose whole shtick is that he interviews people who have interesting personalities or are a bit out there. He gets a letter from a man claiming to have a monster living in the woods outside his property. What I like about the film is the dynamic between these two guys, as they don't actually like each other very much at first, but they end up developing an unlikely friendship. And that's the brilliance of this film. You don't need a high budget to have a really dialogue-heavy film. But unfortunately, even though I do think the film is neat, it didn't fully work for me. The last act of this movie turns into like a Home Alone. It's been previously established in the film that the man has all these booby traps in case the monster would come for him, and that actually becomes the focus, way more so than the monster. And I thought that was a bit of a bummer. I still really like the first half of this film, though. The Sacrifice Game is one of the most recent films on the list, considering it just released a couple of weeks ago. It starts off really promising with one of the coolest openings of the year. We see a home invasion from a voyeur perspective, with the camera moving around the house, looking in through the windows, similarly to Black Christmas or Halloween. But unlike those movies, it's not actually a POV perspective. We see 4 people enter the house, and we, the audience, is peeking in at the violence through the windows. moments. Every once in a while, seemingly out of nowhere, the film has really interesting moments like these, but it's never anything more than that. It's good moments in an otherwise fairly uneven film. It's about two girls who get stuck in a boarding school over Christmas. They are there with one of their teachers, and of course, the four murderers from the opening scene knocks on their door. After that, the film introduces a supernatural element, and it was at that point the film kind of lost me a little bit. They were clearly trying to do a lot with this film, and I really do appreciate the ambition, but it's just too uneven for me to put it higher on the list. In some spots, like the opening, the film looks great, and then in other times, it looks quite cheap. The performances are also all over the place. Some of them are really good, others not so much. It is set on Christmas though, so if you're starving for a new Christmas horror film, this might be worth watching, as long as you go in with the right expectations. What can I really say that hasn't been said before about The Exorcist Believer? It's gotten terrible reviews, and audiences weren't really having it either. Because of the very negative reception, I ended up seeing this way later when it dropped on Peacock, and I think that was a good decision. That's why it ended up a little higher on my list than you might have expected. David Gordon Green consistently gets great performances out of his actors, and his movies always look good. For me, that goes a long way. That always makes his movies at least watchable, but between the two sequels to Halloween 2018 and now this, it's pretty clear that he and his team are stuck in a rut from a writing perspective. It's so clear to me that they tried to reboot The Exorcist the same exact way they did with Halloween, but that doesn't work. The two films aren't really comparable. If this wasn't tied back to the original Exorcist, I probably would have liked this movie a lot more. I actually think the beginning here, the opening 45 or even opening hours is pretty good. It's a little ham-fisted at times, but it looks good, the acting's good, but as soon as they bring back Chris McNeil, everything just falls apart. It's kind of impressive how quickly this thing takes a complete nosedive in quality. In terms of Exorcist sequels, you can actually do a lot worse, but that certainly doesn't make this film great either. Attachment is a love story disguised as a horror film, and for what it is, it's pretty sweet, but the horror elements here didn't really work for me. I like the chemistry between the two leads so much that it actually kind of saves the rest of the film for me, but overall, I'm not crazy about it. Essentially, it's about this couple who just meet and things move very quickly for them. One is moving away. It starts in Denmark, and one of them is moving away from Denmark back home to London, I believe, or at least the UK. I forget exactly where she's moving, but she's moving back to the UK, and her partner just says, okay, well, I'm going with you. And everything moves very quickly, right? And then when we get to the UK, we find out that this woman still lives with her mother, who is very overbearing and very superstitious. It taps into some Jewish folklore, which I thought was pretty fun. This is very much a film I could see someone else liking a whole lot more than me. I didn't hate this movie, not at all. I think it's pretty well made, but a lot of the uncomfortable scenes just kind of read as awkward to me. And as I said, the horror elements maybe didn't fully hit, but it's a very sweet movie, and we don't get a lot of romantic horror films. The Night of the Hunted is about a woman stuck inside a gas station in the middle of the night as a sniper is watching her every move. Ever since I saw Phone Booth as a child, I've been pretty fascinated by movies with snipers. I think it hits the same part of my brain that really likes slasher movies. It's that thrill of watching someone outsmart a faceless killer in a cat and mouse game. The Night of the Hunted is directed by the same director who did the Maniac remake starring Elijah Wood and P2, a French-speaking thriller set in an abandoned parking garage. I like both those movies a lot, so I was pretty excited to check this one out. I think it mostly delivers on its premise. The beginning is really solid, and once you get to the end where, these two characters are kind of beating the shit out of each other in this gas station, it's very entertaining. The problem with the film is that it tries to have a political message, and a lot of the dialogue regarding this is just kind of laughable. A walkie-talkie gets introduced fairly early on, so the sniper can talk to the woman in the gas station, and hearing this guy go on and on about conspiracy theories is so grating. And I think this movie would have been so much better without all of that stuff. Because at its core, this is still a solid one location thriller, but you have to suffer through some of the most cringeworthy dialogue of the year to get to the good stuff. Satanic Hispanics is an anthology film featuring short films from 5 different Latino directors. Out of the 5 segments, there were really only 2 that I enjoyed, one being the wraparound and the other being a fairly comedic story from the director of Shaun of the Dead. I like anthologies, but they're really hard to get right since you never quite know how well the stories are going to flow together unless you have the same team working on all of the segments. But honestly, if you want something kind of breezy and campy, there's fun to be had with this one. I think I tend to be pretty forgiving when it comes to anthology films because by the time you realize that you're not into a segment, it's usually almost over. Suitable Flesh maybe didn't fully work for me, but there are enough things I like about it that I can't help but be impressed by the boldness of it all. This is a super campy Lovecraftian horror film from Joe Lynch, the director of Mayhem and Wrong Turn 2. It's very much a throwback to the Stuart Gordon films of the 80s, but it's somehow even hornier than the stuff he made. Clearly, everyone involved with this movie had a blast making it, and that's what I like most about it. Barbara Crampton stars in the film, and she even has a producer's credit. Heather Graham, who plays the lead, does a great job having it up in some of the more insane parts. But that's actually also my biggest problem with the film. They ham it up a lot, which makes the whole thing seem a little disingenuous. It's like they were trying to make a so bad it's good type of film on purpose, and that rarely works for me. On the other hand, this movie also has one of the best kills of the year, and if you've seen the film, you'll know which one I'm talking about. It's the one with the car. So this is definitely one that I am of 2 minds about, but overall, I'm feeling fairly positive on it. Blood is directed by Brad Anderson and unfortunately has one of the ugliest posters I've seen this year. I'm not crazy, right? This looks incredibly cheap, like especially the backdrop with the boy with red eyes. Anyways, I think Brad Anderson has had an interesting career. I always go out of my way to see his films, even though I haven't loved anything he's done in the past 10 years or so. Session 9 and The Machinist will always hold a special place in my heart, though. There is a surprising amount of setup in this film, considering it's about a vampire child who is reliant on his mother to get the blood he needs to survive. And that's simultaneously the best and worst part of the movie. Just to give some examples of this, the mother is a recovering drug addict, which I think is actually pretty clever since she's now aiding her child in his addiction to human blood. There's a big custody battle subplot, a kidnapping, an evil dog shows up, and then there's a ton of other shit that I can't talk about because I don't want to spoil anything for you. It's never boring, and I like Brad Anderson's directing quite a bit, but I also have to admit that it's pretty messy. I'm still waiting for Brad Anderson to have his next big hit. The original Horror in the High Desert was one of my favorite film discoveries I've made recently. It's a great, underrated found footage film that got a sequel this year, Horror in the High Desert 2, Minerva. It's an alright sequel, but it's missing some of the simplicity that made the original so scary and believable. Some of the found footage sequences here are effective, but I thought the story went in a kind of silly and convoluted direction, which was disappointing. The first one is pretty straightforward. They are apparently making a third one of these, and I'm definitely still interested in checking that one out, so it's not like this turned me off of the series completely. To get more into my specific criticisms, I would actually have to spoil the original film, which I don't want to do because it's very underseen. This is an okay sequel. Make sure to watch the original if you're into found footage. It's really good. In an alternative universe, Cocaine Bear is my favorite film of the year because there's a version of this film that I would have really loved. I really enjoy ridiculous creature features like this. It just needed to go a little harder, I think, be a little more gory and have a little more of a proper monster movie feel. What we instead got was a pretty good adventure comedy with some horror sequences. In short, it's a good title, good poster, good marketing, okay movie. History of the Occult is a conspiracy thriller slash horror hybrid from Argentina that's been making the festival rounds for the past couple of years. If I was only ranking movies based on vibes, this would definitely be in the top 3. It's about a group of journalists exposing a coven of witches and warlocks with connections to the Argentinian government. It's set in the 80s, and most of the film is in black and white. Color gets introduced later in the film when it starts going in a more surreal direction. The entire film is set during the night that this program that the journalists have been working on airs on TV. So a lot of the movie is them huddled in a very small apartment watching television and fearing for their safety. So the film kind of cuts back and forth between the news program and their apartment. I hate that this movie isn't higher on the list because, as I said, the vibes are great and the movie is worth experiencing for that alone. But I have to be honest here and say that I thought the writing here is quite frustrating. I like ambiguous horror. I don't want things to be over-explained, but I found the lack of any real resolution to the story to be a real letdown here, especially since the film is literally about investigative journalists. When I heard the premise for Good Boy, I dropped everything I was doing and rented the film right away. This is a very small Norwegian film about a girl called Sigrid who starts dating a millionaire with a dark secret. He lives together with a man called Frank who acts and dresses up like a dog 24/7. The literal translation of the Norwegian title is You, Me, and Frank, which I think is a better title because the film mostly plays on the uncomfortableness of it all. I enjoyed this film because it's so weird and uncomfortable, but the writing could have been so much better. The main problem here is that they never really give Sigrid a good reason why she should stay with this guy. Like, even if you take away the fact that he lives with this man who dresses up like a dog, there's obviously not great things happening in their relationship. And so, like with History of the Occult, this is another one that I wanted to root for. I wanted to put this higher on the list because of its originality. My main criticism with the film is its ending, though. It's infuriatingly stupid, and this movie made me uncomfortable for most of its runtime, so that's something. But when you do an ending like this, you're gonna be further down on the list. Sick released early this year, and it's mostly notable due to it being written by Kevin Williamson, the writer of Scream. The main thing that makes this film different is that it's set during the pandemic, but other than that, it's very much a run-of-the-mill slasher film. And if you've seen other horror films that Kevin Williamson has written, a lot of this movie is going to feel very familiar. There was one reveal specifically that I could see coming because I'm so familiar with Kevin Williamson's work. That being said, this is a really well-directed film. The whole movie feels like the third act of that original Scream film, where you have a bunch of characters in a house and there's a cat and mouse chase going on. It's directed by the same director who did Alone, which I actually feel pretty similarly about. I think this is a good one to throw on if you're feeling nostalgic for 90s slashers. It definitely has that vibe to it. No One Will Save You is a home invasion alien film that dropped on Hulu a couple of months back. I'm guessing you're gonna see this in a lot of top 10 lists of the year because it's really well made, but this is not my type of film. There are only a couple of lines of dialogue in this entire movie, and I've never cared for that stylistic choice. In fact, I think I gravitate more towards films that are super dialogue heavy, and that's fine. You know, I still like the film. Not everything has to be tailor-made for me. If you want a cool little alien invasion film, check this out. Five Nights at Freddy's did incredibly well at the box office, even though it released on streaming the same day it had its premiere. I am not the target demographic for this movie since I've only played the first game for a little bit before realizing that I didn't enjoy it very much. As a gateway horror for younger people, though, I think there's a lot of fun to be had here. It's just too bad, in my opinion, that the movie focuses so much of its time on fan service rather than telling a cohesive story. I would have also liked a little more Matthew Lillard. I think he's a great presence in this film, and he's so much fun to watch. Overall, this is not a movie that's going to amaze you, but it's fun enough, and fans of the game seem to be happy with it. The Nun 2 was a bit of a surprise hit for me, considering how god-awful I thought the first Nun film was. I'm not saying this is a great film, but it's a significant step up from the first one in pretty much every way. This is a perfectly acceptable Hollywood blockbuster. It's not very scary, but it's entertaining enough. They're not going to do this since the Conjuring universe still makes a lot of money, but there's a part of me that wishes they would kind of rework these films a little bit. I feel like they have a lot of like unnecessary set pieces. Like they feel a lot bigger than they need to be, and in that sort of, you know, adventure movie feel that they have, they lose a bit of the horror for me, if that makes sense. The Boogeyman pairs up nicely with The Nun 2, because I feel very similarly about this film. Nothing here is going to blow your socks off, but it's entertaining enough. I thought the monster design here was actually really cool, and the way it only operates in the dark makes this feel like the Lights Out sequel we never got. This is directed by Rob Savage, who did Host and Dashcam. Both of those movies are smaller found footage films, and I don't want to make it seem like he did a bad job with this film, but you can definitely sense some growing pains, as this is his first big studio movie. The main problem here is that the movie never really finds its tone. I think that's maybe because the original Stephen King story is pretty dark, so they wanted to make it a little more fun, but by doing that, everything just feels a little off. Nevertheless, I had a pretty good time with the film. Pet Sematary Bloodlines is a prequel to the Pet Sematary remake that was released a couple of years back, and as a prequel, it's not great. It takes some pretty big liberties with the source material that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. If you're able to look past that, I do think this is a pretty enjoyable movie. It follows a young Judd as he first encounters the titular Pet Sematary. I think having Judd as the main character was actually a mistake, because the supporting cast here is so fantastic, and they should have actually been the main focus. Henry Thomas, Pam Grier, and David Duchovny all show up and give really fun performances. For what it is, I think it's well put together. It looks real good, and the kill sequences, it's all just sinister. I like that about it. But I don't know. I think I like this maybe a bit more than some other people. I've seen some really harsh reviews. So if you hold like the original Pet Sematary in a really high regard, you probably are not going to enjoy this as much. But if you're able to sort of look at it as its own standalone movie, it's all right. The Pope's Exorcist is ridiculous. It stars Russell Crowe as an ass-kicking priest who does exorcisms on behalf of the Vatican. After getting assigned a case in Spain, he hops on his Vespa, and we get a glorious montage of Russell Crowe riding a Vespa through Europe. As a demon possession movie, this is fairly generic, I have to admit, but there are a lot of really unhinged choices in this film, especially in the third act, that makes this worth watching. I'm not gonna pretend that this movie is like fantastic, but it's one of the most memorable movie experiences I have had all year. Franco Nero plays the Pope. Like, what is going on? It's so bonkers. Swallowed is the latest body horror from Carter Smith, director of The Ruins. He will pop up later on this list as well, because he had 2 movies that released this year. Swallowed starts off really promising. It's about these 2 guys who are doing a drug run, where they swallow these plastic bags and then drive across the border with the drugs undetected. Of course, things don't go exactly as planned, and one of them starts to feel incredibly ill, while his friend is desperately trying to get him some help, but of course the people they're working for aren't going to make things easy. This is another one that kind of falls apart at the end, and it's a little bit of a bummer because the first half is really strong. The body horror here is really horrific. It's not gory, but you're watching this and like the guy is just getting sicker and sicker by the minute. It's so uncomfortable to watch. And then the end of the film kind of turns into a more standard cat and mouse thriller, which I thought was a little disappointing, but overall it's still a solid movie. Manodrome is more of a psychological thriller than a horror movie, but it goes to some really dark places, so I feel comfortable including it on the list. It's kind of similar to David Fincher's Fight Club, but that film has more of a pop sensibility to it, where Manodrome is just kind of depressing. Jesse Eisenberg stars as this Uber driver who spends most of his free time in the gym when he should be taking care of his pregnant girlfriend, played by Odessa Young. His life starts to spiral out of control after coming in contact with a cult disguised as a self-help group for men. Adrien Brody plays the cult leader, and I think he did a wonderful job in this film. Actually, most of the actors do. It's a very well-acted film. There's a specific insecure energy that Jesse Eisenberg captures, and he's known for these types of performances, right? But I find it, with this one, like, it's very fascinating and very current. It's not insecure like you've seen him in comedy films. It's a more, like, scary type of insecure. He's that person that will pick a fight with someone for looking at him the wrong way. We don't get a ton of background into his character, but through his interactions with his girlfriend, we come to find out that he wasn't always this way, and it's just very sad. The third act of this film is where it starts to get really dark, and that's where it actually starts to feel like a horror movie. You've probably seen something like this before. I mean, I mentioned Fight Club, and there's a fair share of Taxi Driver in here as well. So it's maybe not the most original film in the world, and that's why it's not super high on the list, but I do think this is really solid. Megalomaniac is a Belgian film that's very clearly inspired by the new French extremity movement of the 2000s. I saw this at a film festival over a year ago, but it actually had its official release this year. I paired this up with Manodrome because I feel quite similarly about the two films. They're good, but perhaps a little too derivative of other works to be placed higher on the list. If you're like me and enjoy these really bleak, violent, depressing films, like the new French extremity movies, you'll probably enjoy this. It's about the daughter of a famous serial killer whose life starts to spiral out of control once a copycat killer emerges. That plot description is honestly pretty vague, but I don't want to give away anything. It never goes anywhere that feels fully original, but I thought it was a neat throwback to the more extreme films of the 2000s. It's a Wonderful Knife is exactly what it sounds like. A slasher parody of the Christmas classic It's a Wonderful Life. As you can see from the poster, it's by the writer of Freaky, who did this exact same thing, but in that one, it was of course riffing on Freaky Friday. I was a big fan of Freaky, so I was pretty excited to see It's a Wonderful Knife, and overall, it's a perfectly fine movie. I like it, it has fun kills. The biggest bummer is that it follows the structure of It's a Wonderful Life pretty closely, so if you know that story, you can clearly see where the movie is going, and a lot of that just kills the suspense. But I don't want to make this seem like it's a bad movie, because it's really not. The mask the killer wears is super cool, and I enjoyed the cast a lot. There's just been a lot of slashers this year, and a lot of them have been fairly comedic. Like, for example, there's another holiday slasher on this list that I like more. There's another slasher with a fantasy element that I like more on this list. If this had released any other year, it would have been higher on the list, but the slasher competition is just too brutal this year. Malum is definitely the weirdest project on this list. It's a remake of the 2014 indie hit Last Shift from that same director, but with a bigger budget. If you haven't seen Last Shift, it was actually one of my favorite movies of 2014, and I think it's a lot better than Malum. There's nothing in this story that gets better with a bigger budget, and that's why I think it was such an ill-advised project from the get-go. I still think Malum is pretty good, though, on its own. There's just a better version of this movie from 9 years ago. Sympathy for the Devil is the first entry for Nicolas Cage on the list. In the beginning of this movie, he jumps into the back of a man's car, points a gun at him, and tells him to just drive. And that's most of the movie. Nicolas Cage with dyed red hair sitting in the back of this car, tormenting a seemingly average guy. You know, standard Nicolas Cage shit. He does a good job in films like this. I like Nicolas Cage a lot. He manages to take these sort of run-of-the-mill thrillers and make them a lot more fun with the energy he brings to his performances. So if that sounds like something you would enjoy, I recommend you give this movie a go. Anyone else can probably stay away, honestly, because you've seen this movie before. You know what this is. Raging Grace is a very good movie bogged down by an incredibly slow first act. I usually love slow burn horror films, but this one tested even my patience. It's about an illegal immigrant working as a housekeeper in the UK. She and her daughter are homeless, so they are essentially squatting these houses she's working in. So she's like a housekeeper for some clients and a house sitter for others. Basically just finding work where it's available. When she gets a job working in a mansion out in the countryside, she of course brings her daughter along as well, who she has to hide from the owners. Because of the setup to this film, I've seen it compared to Parasite, but this goes way harder in a horror direction than that movie. In fact, what I just described to you is the very start of the film, because I think it goes in so many interesting directions. The less you know about this one before you go into it, the better, I think. It is a shame the film takes such a long time to get going, though. If this was better paced, it could have easily been in my top 10 of the year. It's that well made. Scream 6 might be the most controversial placement on the list, but we're at a point now where I like all these films, and I must admit that I did not love Scream 6. I was really disappointed by the killer reveal in this film and the amount of plot armor the characters have, but hey, I have made it a point not to spoil any of the movies that I'm talking about today, so why start now? I'm just gonna leave that there. The ones who have seen the film will know what I'm talking about. There is a lot to like about this movie, though. The change of setting worked really well. I especially like the scene in the bodega where Ghostface kills someone with a shotgun. It's a really good moment that actually surprised me a little bit, and I thought that was really cool that we're, 6 films in, and they still managed to pull off moments like that. They also brought back one of my favorite characters from the whole franchise, so that was really fun for me. Scream is one of those franchises where even the worst films are pretty good, so it all just kind of comes down to personal preference. I will say, though, that I'm pretty bummed that we won't get to see Christopher Landon's Scream 7 with Melissa Barrera and Jenna Ortega. Those thoughts are maybe for another video. There are still so many movies to talk about. I can't go on a tangent about this. I'm just very, very sad about the whole situation. Dark Harvest is from the director of 30 Days of Night, which is a film I haven't seen in quite a while, but I have really fond memories of it. I wanted to bring up 30 Days of Night because this film is also about chaos erupting in a small town. It's set in the 60s in a small Midwest town that annually gets terrorized by a monster they called Sawtooth Jack. I really like the monster design here. It reminds me of Pumpkinhead. Every year, the night of Sawtooth Jack's assault on the town, the senior boys of the high school is tasked with hunting him down. Whoever succeeds in doing this is promised a huge prize. I forget if they say what the prize actually is, but they basically treat it as a way to get out of this town that they feel stuck in. I'm not really sure who this movie was made for because the premise is so wild, yet they play it so straight. It also has this young adult theme. Like, I've seen this be compared to the Hunger Games, and I understand where people are coming from because you follow this angsty teenager who has to rise to the occasion and he fights with his parents and all that stuff. But then again, it's also incredibly gory and gets surprisingly dark at times. So, as you can probably tell, this movie is a little all over the place, but I still really like it. I like it a lot, actually. I don't know if it did well enough to get a sequel, but I would definitely be down to watch Sawtooth Jack absolutely wreak havoc on another Midwest town. When Evil Lurks is the sleeper hit of the year. It's an Argentinian movie that released on Shudder, and a lot of people have this pegged as their favorite horror movie of the year. Obviously, it's not at the top at my list, but I really liked it. It's about this epidemic of demon possession in a small village. We follow a divorced father who tries to protect his family amidst all the chaos. What I like about this film is that it actually feels dangerous. No one is safe in this film. Death comes quickly, seemingly out of nowhere in some instances, so the whole film has this panicked hopelessness to it as the characters are scrambling to get away. This film is incredibly violent, so just know that going in. It's very rare for me to have issues watching gore, but there was a scene here pretty early on that actually made me a little nauseous. And for those who have seen the film, I will just say it involves a man lying on a bed. For the majority of this film, I thought for sure it was going to be in my top 10, but I ended up not loving the ending. They introduce a character pretty late whose only job it is to spit exposition at you, and I thought that was completely unnecessary. Them actually explaining a lot of what was going on made the film a lot less scary to me. I also had a hard time connecting with the characters, but I really do think the first 45 minutes here are fantastic. I would definitely recommend you watch this one. Project Wolf Hunting is a really fun action horror movie hybrid from South Korea that I talked about in my previous video about hidden gem films from the past year. All the films I talked about in that video will of course be on this list, so I won't spend too much time talking about them here. I recommend you go watch my previous video if you haven't seen that one yet. In sheer amount of violence, this is definitely the goriest film on the list. So if that sounds like something you'd be into, definitely check this one out. Out of everything that I mentioned on my hidden gems list, this is the lowest rated, and the reason for that is that it maybe gets a little too melodramatic for me in the end. They try to bring some emotion and humanity into the script in that very last 20 minutes, and I feel like it's a little unwarranted. It's a very entertaining film, though. The Wrath of Becky was also featured in my previous video. This is a super fun sequel, even though it is quite similar to the first film. Lulu Wilson is still really fun in this role, and Sean William Scott plays the bad guy in this one, and he's really great. I had a lot of fun with this. Night Siren comes from the Czech Republic and is about a woman returning to the mountain village she grew up in after getting a mysterious letter about an inheritance. Apart from one person she becomes friends with, the rest of the locals are not very happy that she's come back. They are all incredibly superstitious, and the tensions just keep rising as allegations of witchcraft are brought forth. It's impossible to overstate how bad the vibes are in this village. Like, it just feels like Resident Evil 4 is about to break out at any moment. Like, it's so oppressive. From reading reviews of this film, it seems like a lot of people went in with the wrong expectations. This movie's not actually about witches, it's about paranoia and misogyny. So if you go in expecting a full-on supernatural horror, you're going to be disappointed. The one thing that kept this movie from being higher on the list is that I think the ending is a little abrupt. There's like one really big plot line that doesn't get resolved, and I get that it was intentionally left that way, but the problem is that the movie is rather slow, so I wish they didn't spend so much time on something that wasn't going to be resolved. It's so hard to talk about this without spoiling it, so let's just move on to the next entry on the list. Mr. Organ is the first out of 2 documentaries on the list. This is directed by David Farrier, and if you've seen any of his other work, like the movie Tickled, you'll understand why I put this on the list. I actually discovered Tickled through the horror community, and I haven't seen too many people talk about this one, so I had to include it. Mr. Organ is another fascinating deep dive into a dark, twisted rabbit hole. David Farrier seemed to have carved out a niche for himself by making these investigative documentaries that feel like horror movies. It starts with David writing a story about a bizarre scam in Auckland, New Zealand. There's this woman who owns an antique store who's hired an enforcer to clamp any cars that parks outside of her store when it's not open. That enforcer is the titular Mr. Organ. He torments these people and gets them to pay absurd amount of money for him to unclamp their cars. As David starts looking into Mr. Organ specifically, an all-out psychological war begins. When I think about what really scares me, it's what humans can do to each other. Mr. Organ essentially makes it his mission to ruin David Farrier's life because he's reporting on him. It's an infuriating yet fascinating watch. I mean, it stands out on the list because it is a documentary, right? But I just had to include it because what he goes through, David Farrier goes through in this movie, is like my complete nightmare. And I'm going off script here a little bit, but to expand on that, I guess it's this whole idea that anyone in your life can really make it a mission to like, no, I'm gonna fuck this guy specifically. This guy specifically, fuck this guy. Let's ruin this guy's life. And if that person like completely disregards everything else in their life, like their job, their family, like whatever, they just break, psychologically and decide that I'm gonna ruin this person's life, they can really do damage. And I don't know, that's just, it's terrifying yet fascinating for a documentary. Saw X is my favorite Saw sequel, and to be fair, this is not really my favorite franchise, so it's not the highest bar to cross, but I mean, I love the original, and every other one I've just enjoyed in a so bad they're good type of way. The more ridiculous they got, the more I enjoyed them, but Saw X is legitimately great in some aspects. Tobin Bell finally gets a really good leading performance, and he brings some much needed humanity to John Kramer as a character. I also liked how clearly the movie called out his moral hypocrisy. I actually wish there was a little more of that stuff. There is a trap in this movie that involves someone cutting out their own leg, and it's one of the most grueling scenes I've seen all year. And I know how insane that sounds, because literally that's what happens in the first film. But I promise you, it's the most brutal thing you'll see all year. I was also a really big fan of the Cecilia Peterson character. She was so deliciously evil and a perfect match for John Kramer. I think I actually like her a lot more than John Kramer and Amanda. Like, as I said, this is not really my franchise, so I was really surprised that I enjoyed this as much as I did. Brooklyn 45 is a chamber piece from the director of We Are Still Here, which is a really great film from 2015. The film is set in 1945 when a group of war veterans from the Second World War meets in an apartment to honor the memory of a friend of theirs that recently passed away. After they hold an impromptu seance, they awaken something, and after that, they all just become very suspicious of each other. It's part supernatural horror, part spy thriller, and you're not really sure if there actually is a spy amongst them. It's a neat blending of genres that I actually hadn't seen before. The cast really shines in this movie, because the whole thing takes place inside of one room, and there's a lot of dialogue. Horror legend Larry Fessenden gives one of his best performances here as a grieving husband who is trying to make sense out of his wife's suicide. He's actually the reason why they're doing the seance in the first place. He does this long, 12 Angry Men-esque monologue where he convinces them all one by one to sit down and take part of the seance. It was at that point I knew the film was going to be something special. Before we move on, I want to say that this is maybe a bit more lighthearted than I'm making it out to be. There are definitely some darker moments, but it's a pretty easy watch. It has a bit of a creep show or Tales from the Crypt type of energy to it. So, I mean, I thought this was a lot of fun. We don't get a lot of movies in that style anymore. Megan was such a fun surprise this year. This movie actually has a lot in common with the Child's Play remake they did a couple of years back. I know that movie wasn't super popular with people who are deep in the Chucky fandom, but I'm a bit of an apologist for it. I guess I really like this idea of a killer with an AI that gets progressively smarter as the movie keeps going. I'm sure we've all seen these, nightmare stories on the news about how AI is coming to take all of our jobs. So in that way, Megan feels really current, but most importantly, it's a lot of fun. Speaking of Chucky, every Killer Doll movie is going to be compared to Child's Play, and I think they did a really good job at giving Megan her own energy and personality. I'm sure there's going to be lots of sequels to this movie, and if they play their cards right, I think we have a new horror icon on our hands. There's a part of me that wishes they went a little harder with the violence in this film, but I understand they toned it down a bit to appeal to a younger audience. It's a very campy film, made deliberately so. seeing that this was from the same writer as James Wan's *Malignant* actually made a lot of sense to me, because they have similar energies. They're going for a very campy romp, and I do tend to enjoy those films a lot. Candyland is another film that was included in my video about hidden gem films from the past year. If this was maybe a little more polished, it could have definitely been in the top 10 for me. It's a slasher following a group of sex workers who finds clients at a truck stop nicknamed Candyland. The thing I found most interesting about this film is that it has very much a whodunit type of setup, but for the majority of the film, you actually know who the killer is. This idea has been toyed with in other films, but I've never seen it done in quite this way. The film also has a pretty grungy style to it that I think matches the material nicely. Check this out if you're into slashers. I think Renfield deserved better. It didn't do great at the box office, and in general, I feel like the film kind of came and went with a lukewarm reception. And honestly, even though I really like this film, it's kind of hard to rate this compared to other films on the list, because this is so goofy and so out there. It's the type of comedy where pretty much every actor is just doing their own thing. If you like Nicholas Hoult, you'll probably enjoy him here. If you like some of that strange acting, some of those weird choices that we get from Nicolas Cage, you're probably gonna like him here too. The same goes for the supporting cast. I find both Awkwafina and Ben Schwartz hilarious, so of course I also like them in this film. We don't really get a lot of comedies like this anymore, especially not horror comedies, but this was such a breath of fresh air for me. I understand that this is not for everyone, but it's definitely one of the movies I had the most fun with this year. The Royal Hotel follows two women backpacking in Australia. To help fund their trip, they take on odd jobs from various employment agencies. At the start of the film, they are in Sydney, but then they have to relocate to an outback town to work as bartenders at a local pub called the Royal Hotel. This takes a lot of inspiration from a documentary called Hotel Coolgardie about two Finnish backpackers, and a lot of the scenes in this film are lifted straight from that documentary. I wanted to say this because if you only decide to watch the Royal Hotel, a lot of the things that happen seem almost too outrageous to be true. But it isn't really until the third act of the film where they start diverging from the story we see in the documentary. It's very close to the real story, and then at the end, they change it a little bit. What this film manages to do really well is build dread. These two women suffer so much harassment in this bar. Their only chance of survival is just playing along with everything, and you're watching these situations get more and more uncomfortable. It's definitely another type of horror than a lot of the other movies on this list, and I have a feeling that it's not going to work for everybody, but I thought it was very effective. I was not sure what I thought about the ending until I watched the documentary, because even though they diverge from the real story quite heavily, it feels like a more fitting ending. I compared Birth Rebirth to Pet Sematary in my previous video about hidden gem films from the year, and the more I think about that comparison, the more it sort of clicked into place for me. Like, the movies occupy a very similar part in my brain now, if that makes sense. It's about this mortician and a nurse. They're working together to reanimate the dead. It's also an exploration of grief. I don't think you'll be too surprised where the story goes, but that doesn't really matter since the characters are so interesting. In some ways, you could probably argue that this is the darkest film on the list, because it goes to some very sinister places. And once again, that's somewhere where that Pet Sematary influence comes into play. Venus is a Spanish horror film that has a lot of ideas and somehow manages to juggle them all pretty successfully. This is definitely going to get some comparisons to Evil Dead Rise, considering it's a very gory horror film also set in an apartment complex. I included this in my Hidden Gems video because I haven't heard too many people talk about it, and I think it's a shame. I really liked Esther Exposito as the lead in this film, and I hope we get to see her in more horror movies because she's an excellent final girl. And once again, you can check out my previous video for a little bit more information regarding the film. Hollywood Dreams and Nightmares, the Robert Englund story, is the second and last documentary on the list. This is exactly what it sounds like. A documentary exploring Robert Englund's career before, during, and after his time as the iconic Freddy Krueger. It's not quite as polished as a Netflix or HBO documentary, but I think it gets close enough. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a ton of people talking about this, so that's why I really wanted to highlight it here. I think this is a must-watch for horror fans. In some ways, I feel like this documentary is Robert Englund's Lifetime Achievement Award. I know that he is loved by this community, but I did not know how loved he was by his peers. The amount of heartwarming stories in this documentary is simply staggering. Robert never set out to be a horror icon, and he's very candid about that. He was worried that the role of Freddy Krueger was going to typecast him as a horror guy, and obviously that's kind of what happened. However, he never took it for granted, and because of that, he's been able to continue working and still get amazing opportunities that most actors could only dream of. There's a heartfelt message here about never giving up, being easy to work with, and most of all, being kind. So if you're ever in a bad mood, you feel like the world's gone to shit, or that you're never going to make it in life, be sure to watch this. I don't know if it will turn your day around, but it was incredibly inspiring to me. I was a little worried going into the theater to watch Evil Dead Rise. Not because I thought it was going to be bad or anything, I just loved the 2013 Evil Dead so much. No matter how much I tried to temper my expectations, they were honestly through the roof. While I still prefer that remake they did, Evil Dead Rise is another great entry into this franchise. My main worry was that they were going to play it a little safer since there are children in this movie, and I was delighted to find out that they did not hold anything back. Between the financial success of this movie and the critical acclaim of When Evil Lurks, it seems like the appetite for this type of really dark horror is stronger than ever, and I'm all here for it. Also, what an incredible opening to this movie. That's usually the type of fan service that I kind of roll my eyes at, but here it was so well done I couldn't help but have a big smile on my face. My Animal is a hybrid between a coming-of-age drama and a werewolf horror film. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this movie, which is why I included it in my Hidden Gems video. The film is gorgeous. It takes place on the outskirts of a small Canadian town in the 1980s. It takes a more grounded approach to its time period than what we're used to. After Stranger Things, I feel like that became the default style when depicting the 80s, and this is definitely not that. I also don't want to give the impression that this is a super scary movie. It's more of a coming-of-age drama with horror elements. The idea of using a werewolf curse as an allegory for otherness might not be the most original idea in the world, but it's done really well here. I find it quite touching. I'm not sure how I feel about jumping into the leave the world behind discourse, but here we are. This seems to be a really polarizing film, and for some, calling this a horror movie will be a stretch. I've seen people call this a psychological thriller about the end of the world, and I'm sorry, but that reads like a horror movie to me. Films about the end of the world has always fascinated me because of what that means, the end of the world. It's shifted over time, you know? In the sci-fi horror movies of the 50s, the fear of the atom bomb took shape of large monsters. George Romero's zombie films are just as much about people killing people as zombies killing people. And then at the dawn of the new millennium, there was of course Y2K. Leave the World Behind combines all these fears and even throws in some new ones like the dangers of misinformation. Apart from some questionable CGI, I thought this was an excellent film with one of the best ensemble casts of the year. The film seems to be really divisive though, so you might not care for it, even though I love it, and that's perfectly okay. The Conference is one of those Netflix originals that just kind of came and went. I feel like every movie on there eventually gets lost in the shuffle a week or two after its release. Because of this, The Conference was included in my Hidden Gems list of the year. This is a Swedish slasher about a group of municipal workers at a team-building retreat being stalked by a masked killer. Someone told me that this was filmed like an hour away from where I live, but I have not been able to verify that information. I've looked, and I don't think that's correct, but it certainly looks like it could have been, and that's neat for me. Anyways, we don't really make a lot of horror movies here in Sweden, so it feels good to be able to rep my home country a little bit. The thing that I said in my previous video regarding this is that it is a horror comedy, and I think, you know, comedy doesn't always translate really well. I find it really funny, but I don't know how it's going to come across when you're reading subtitles. But Even if you don't find the humor very funny, I think there's a lot of really brutal kills here and some very clever editing. The kill transitions in particular are amazing. Knock at the Cabin is very much M. Night Shyamalan being back on his bullshit. A lot of the themes you've seen in his other movies are present here. Depending on how you feel about him as a director, that's either a very good thing or a very bad thing. I've always liked his style because even though his movies aren't always great, he takes really big swings. Knock at the Cabin isn't up there with The Sixth Sense, Unbreakable, or Split, but it's just a tier below that in my opinion. The majority of this film is 7 people in a cabin talking about the end of the world. Remember what I said before about me being into really dialogue-heavy films? This is my type of shit right here. You've probably already heard about how great Dave Bautista is in this film, and that's true, but I think the whole cast is great. Shyamalan has ended up in this kind of weird spot where people are either really disappointed with his films when they don't have a mind-blowing twist at the end, but if they do have a twist, other people will criticize him for relying too much on gimmicks. There's obviously not going to be any spoilers from me, but I'll just say I really like the ending. VHS 85 is a bit of a personal pick for me. This is my favorite horror franchise, with a close second being Evil Dead. Not to get too sentimental here, but 2023 has been kind of a weird year for me. I'm about to turn 30, and I set a goal for myself that I needed to figure out what I wanted to do with my life before then. Like, I didn't need to achieve that goal. I just wanted to be able to say that I'm working towards something. So the day that VHS 85 dropped, I'm at work, and every moment I had to myself, I was thinking about going home and watching this damn movie. I was also thinking about talking to my horror friends about the movie afterwards, and that's kind of when everything clicked into place for me. Like, I needed to put more effort into this channel, but I also needed to find a job that would allow me to practice my writing. And if anyone cares, it's actually looking up for me. I'm starting a new job here just in a couple of days, and I'm very excited about it. I know I haven't talked about the actual film. I think my whole point here is that lists like these shouldn't be taken super seriously because we all have these films that we have a very personal connection to. But don't get me wrong, I do think VHS 85 is damn good. It's my favorite one since VHS 2. I like all of the shorts here. If you've seen any of these movies though, you know what you're going to get. But if you like that, this is a really good one of those. I thought some of the promotion material for Thanksgiving looked really promising, but I was still a little skeptical going into it. I like a lot of what Eli Roth does for the horror genre. His History of Horror TV show and podcast are great. But as far as the movies he's actually directed, I think the last one I liked was Hostel, and that was a long time ago at this point. This is a modern take on the 80s slasher, and I think that style meshes really well with Eli Roth's twisted sense of humor. This is a very fun movie, and I'm glad they leaned into the ridiculousness of it all. They consistently make the most fun creative choice in this film, and it has some of the best moments of the year for me. A lot of those moments aren't even kills or chase sequences, but those are of course excellent too. They've already greenlit a sequel to this thing, and usually I'm not crazy about sequels, but honestly, if they want to make 10 more of these, I'm all in. Talk to Me is the movie you've heard everyone praising this year, so I don't have to spend a lot of time on it. The directors of this film have been very candid that they tried to make this movie for years, but they couldn't find the right people to work with. It seems like they have had some problems getting this thing off of the ground because a lot of studios wanted them to change some key aspects of the story. I'm so thankful they stuck to their guns because this is the type of story we've seen before, but we haven't seen it done in this way. Like, their unique perspective on it is what makes it, special. This is a very dark movie, but it also has a youthful energy to it that is so infectious. The whole movie also hit way different for me on a rewatch. Knowing where the story ends at the start of the movie kind of made me reinterpret the whole thing, and that's actually what made it a lock for my top 10. Before we move on, I also want to say that this is a horror movie about teenagers that's actually quite mature. It handles the subject matter with a finer touch than what we've come to expect from these type of horror films revolving around teenagers. I think it's really cool. Totally Killer is very reminiscent of a film that dropped in 2015 called The Final Girls. It actually looked so similar that I almost didn't watch it because I thought it was a ripoff. See, I love The Final Girls. It's a movie that holds a very special place in my heart. After seeing the positive response to Totally Killer, I did eventually cave and watch the film, and I'm glad I did. The films are eerily similar in some ways, but Totally Killer gets away with it because it's just so much fun. This is a comedy first, slasher second. It's kind of like the opposite of Thanksgiving in that way. Kieran Shipka is hilarious in this role as a high school girl that is sent back in time to the 80s to solve a string of murders. The plot is absolute nonsense, and the movie knows it. It's very heightened and ridiculous. It's kind of like Renfield in that way, where it sort of feels like a comic book. The best part of this movie is that they're poking fun at both current culture and 80s culture. Just this idea that this girl travels back in time to the 80s only for her to be bullied by her own mother is hilarious to me. Like, she's just watching in terror as the young version of her mom is saying some absolute vile shit to her. The slasher mystery is fun too, but the comedy is definitely the focus here. Sick of Myself is a dark comedy that heavily leans into body horror. This is a Norwegian film, and the director of this actually had his first English language film come out this year as well, Dream Scenario. I didn't include that one because, apart from a scene or two, I more read it as a straight comedy. Sick of Myself gets really disturbing, though. It's about this girl, Signe, who's in a really toxic relationship with a self-absorbed artist. In the beginning, you're not quite sure why they're together, but then you realize that Signe is just as self-obsessed, and they're kind of feeding off each other's narcissism. After a workplace incident that honestly, Signe inserts herself into. She realizes that she can get a lot of attention by, like, faking injuries or faking being sick. It's interesting because both this and Dream Scenario have a lot of common themes. They are both about ordinary people who desperately want to be special. In Sick of Myself, there's this need for attention that makes Signe hurt herself in some pretty grueling ways. But as I said, it's also a comedy. It leans into the cringe factor of it all, and I'm usually pretty good at handling that stuff, but some of these scenes are just excruciating to watch. I highly recommend this one, especially if you like Dream Scenario. The Passenger is the feel-good horror movie of the year. I know that sounds insane because this movie literally starts with a workplace shooting and it goes to some dark places after that, but the heart of this movie is very optimistic, and that's what I like about it. So many horror movies are about trauma, and this one is actually about overcoming it. The film is a road horror movie, kind of similar to The Hitcher in some aspects. Kyle Gallner has been showing up in a lot of genre stuff lately, and he gives a great performance here as an unhinged killer who takes his co-worker hostage. I've talked a lot about third acts that have disappointed me this year. This film actually has an amazing third act where the movie slows down a little bit, but trust me, it's all better for it. There's a part of me that thinks it's crazy that I have Cobweb at number 3 because this movie is insane, but honestly, putting it lower than this just didn't feel right to me. This is this year's Malignant. It's a schlocky B movie with an A-tier budget, and that means the movie is definitely gonna throw some people off. I've seen people call this the worst movie of the year, and my guess is that those people don't have very much of an appreciation for camp. I mean, I obviously can't speak for those people, right? But if you just look at the plot summary on, like, Wikipedia, it sounds like something you would see on the video shelves in the 80s. Like, it reads like the third sequel of a batshit insane series of movies. And if you have an appreciation for that, I think you're gonna have a really good time. Maybe watch it with some friends. Influencer is one of those films that's really hard to talk about because I don't want to give anything away. I know some people are tired of social media based horror, but I still like it when it's done right. There's so much in influencer culture that you can pull from or satirize. I know I said this before about this film, but the thing that really struck me was the structure of it all. Each act follows a different character, and they have so much fun with that. Having this structure allows them to get really crazy in the last minute of each act, and then, you know, at the start of the next act, we're sort of pulled back a little bit as the new perspective is introduced. I'm a huge fan of this movie. I think it does a lot of really smart stuff, and yeah, just go see it. I also talked about it in my previous video. I watched Infinity Pool back in February, and I knew right away that this was the movie that every other movie had to beat. It's from Brandon Cronenberg, who previously did Possessor, which was also excellent. I like movies with big ideas, and Infinity Pool has a lot of them. If I tell you what those ideas actually are, I feel like I'm going to be spoiling a lot, so this is going to be a little tricky. This is a sci-fi horror where the character of James, played by Alexander Skarsgård, is introduced to a world without consequences by Mia Goth's character. Both of them are in relationships, but they go on this weird hedonistic spiral together where things get incredibly dark incredibly quickly. I feel like this is a fantasy that most people have probably had at some point in their life, you know, just kind of wanting to like fuck off forever and not caring about any of their responsibilities. And when you fantasize about it, I mean, it's fine, it's freeing, but then you also realize that there's a bit of a darkness there, and that's really what this movie explores. I'm sure there's going to be lots of people who disagree with me on this, because this is another one that's been kind of divisive, but I think this has one of the most haunting endings of the entire year. And I mean, I saw this in February, as I said, and I'm still thinking about this ending. And that's it. We made it. I just want to say Happy New Year. I know this is like we're into January at this point, but still want to say Happy New Year to everyone. And I appreciate everyone who's taking the time to comment and liking, subscribing. You know, it's like so heartwarming to me when someone watches one of my videos and then like recommends me something that they'll think I like. I've been getting so many comments, and I've been putting so much stuff on my watch list, and I'm excited to dig into all of it this year. Anyways, stay safe, guys, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.